Hi, I'm Marcin Kuśmierczyk. Welcome to Eastern Insights. Why does Eastern Europe's perspective on global affairs matter? Because here, history and geopolitics collide in ways that shape our world. Yet these voices often go unheard. This podcast bridges this gap. Each episode translates in-depth analysis from my Polish YouTube channel, Polityka Zagraniczna, which means international politics. For the last few years, this platform has dissected foreign policy, security, and the forces shaping Eastern Europe. Using AI tools like 11 Labs, we adapt these nuanced insights into English, preserving their depth while making them accessible to all. Whether we're unpacking Russia's latest moves, EU debates, or security challenges in Central Europe, our mission is simple: to foster informed dialogue by sharing Eastern Europe's untold stories. If you're curious about the world beyond headlines, subscribe now. Join me as we decode the complexities of global affairs, one Eastern European insight at a time.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. You know, it was supposed to be a holiday, a moment of quiet after a really long and exhausting election campaign. But instead, we're seeing a highly emotional, very serious political crisis unfolding right before our eyes. Now, at first glance, this crisis seems to be all about migration. But truly, migration isn't the only important dimension of what's happening on Poland's western border. In fact, it's also, and perhaps above all, an international conflict. It's a clash of interests between Poland and Germany, a dispute that could really shape the outcome of this bigger battle over the scope of state competence in European politics. Because ultimately, that's what this major political fight over migration might just concern. So, let's dive in. I think it's worth asking ourselves right at the start. Why is the situation on Poland's western border causing such a massive stir? Why does the government have to operate in crisis mode? Why has this issue completely taken over social media and dominated Polish political life? Of course, migration itself is a very exciting, highly emotional political topic. A few months ago, I actually discussed how rapidly the sentiment towards migration is radicalizing across the entire continent, and Poland is absolutely no exception to this trend. What's happening here aligns perfectly with the general European trend. Everywhere from north to south, east to west, and across the political spectrum, from left to right, the mood towards migration is dramatically worsening. To win elections today, you often need a clear anti-migration stance. This even leads to situations, and not just in Poland, where groups that once held completely different views on migration are now skeptical. But while migration is certainly an explosive topic, a lighter was also needed to ignite this particular fire. And that lighter is Germany. Poland has become a target country for migration. This is an absolutely new phenomenon for us, because for hundreds of years, generations of Poles have experienced the exact opposite. They migrated from these lands, not to them. You can think of distant, almost forgotten examples, like the great wave of Polish migration to Brazil at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. Just imagine how desperate those people must have been. Or, you can look at examples we all know, like the migration after Poland joined the European Union. It's really worth remembering this, because, to put it colloquially, this key has two ends. Meaning, migration has two ends. It's incredibly difficult to achieve a situation where no one wants to leave a place, and at the same time, no one wants to move to that place. It's also worth appreciating, from this perspective, that Poland has stopped being a place you have to leave to hope for a better life. When I was in school, the idea of leaving the country for a better life elsewhere was practically the dream future for many of us. Thankfully, that situation has radically changed over the past few decades. In any case, Poland is now a country to which, officially, more people arrive than leave. Poland has a net positive migratory balance. You can see with your own eyes how quickly the number of arrivals from often very distant countries is increasing in Poland. You see it most clearly in big cities, especially Warsaw, where it's noticeable at every turn. But this phenomenon is already reaching beyond just the capital. This situation is changing very dynamically. And again, while we can rely on statistics, it's also pretty obvious that statistics only show a limited slice of reality. Anecdotal evidence, the kind that doesn't prove anything, but certainly shows something, can be illuminating. For instance, I recently took an Uber with a remarkably talkative guy from Central Asia. I don't recall his exact country, but he openly told me he has no documents and can't leave Poland, so he hasn't seen his family in 3 years. He also mentioned he'd traveled to Germany, and while he could earn more there, he lives much more calmly and better in Poland. I have no idea how he got there, how he makes money this way, or how he lives. I truly have no idea how it all works. But again, this anecdotal evidence, I think, highlights two things. Firstly, Poland is a country where people come to earn money. Poland is a target for migration. And secondly, in this completely new phenomenon for our country over the last century, Poland as a state is not particularly well prepared. A lot is happening here in a gray zone. Now, it's not Uzbeks from Uber or kebab stands set up by migrants from Bangladesh. That is, it's not a sudden increase in the scale of migration that led to such emotional and political upheaval in Poland. It's not the sheer scale of migration on the western border that made people shout to stand on the border. It wasn't a visa scandal that stirred such great political emotions. It wasn't a tragedy or crimes involving migrants that led to some long-term general Polish uproar. It's not migration in general that's the cause of the current political crisis, but migration with this particular spice, this particular component, and that component is the Germans. Because it's one thing to have our own inability, it's one thing to have some corruption within our own structures, it's one thing to lack organization, it's one thing to lack a well-thought-out migration policy of our own, but it's quite another when a foreign country acts, when the services of another allied country undermine our borders by pushing unwanted migrants across. Perhaps, though, the words about undermining migrants are an exaggeration. Perhaps I'm getting emotional here. Perhaps the fervor of this political crisis is driving me. Well, I think it's worth giving a voice to the Germans themselves, who describe the matter in Die Welt this way. The whole situation is reportedly based on a German government report. At least that's what the German media are reporting. And apparently the Germans wanted to hand over an 18-year-old Afghan to Poland, but the Polish border guard refused. So what did the Germans do? Let me quote now. The federal police had to make a change of decision, but the commander of the Polish border guard allegedly refused to cross the bridge to the Afghan. According to Spiegel, the federal police later sent an 18-year-old across the border to Poland in Bat Muskow, i.e. in Morzikow, about 60 kilometers away. There was neither the self-defense group, i.e. the border defense movement, nor the Polish border guards. So in a situation where the Polish border guard refused to accept a person, the Germans drove 60 kilometers away to a place where there were no Polish border guards and simply let the individual into Poland that way. It's difficult not to call this an abduction of migrants, and we're talking about German media based on a German government report and data from the German police. They themselves are telling us that this is how they abduct migrants. And it seems to me that this particular case, as described by Die Welt, was the very heart of this political crisis. Of course, there are many other issues that can stir emotions. Some droning by German services, the general behavior of German services on the border, the completely asymmetrical involvement of the Polish state compared to the German state on the border. There's also the fact that for a long time, Polish government representatives presented data coming from Germany, and the fact that government policy shifted 170 degrees in just a few dozen hours. There are many issues that can raise justified emotions. But I think this single case truly shows the core of the problem. Because the Germans are pushing those migrants to Poland whom they consider illegal and who they claim came from Poland. Now, the fact that there will be cases of people who come from Poland illegally and end up in Germany is completely obvious. Because while Poland is now a target country for migration, it's still very much a transit country. These people are primarily heading to Germany. However, the major problem is that this completely unclear, unformalized method by which the Germans are sending migrants back to us is based solely on the decisions of German services. It's based on their decisions, their behavior, their actions. And it seems to me that this, first and foremost, truly pissed off many Poles. It angered many Poles more than any incompetence on the part of any Polish policy or any Polish government. But it also, I think, aroused justified emotions, because it gets to the heart of the matter. Where will the center of gravity for decisions lie regarding who can and cannot enter the territory of our country? What will be the scope of competence for states in European policy in this regard? And what will the relationship between Poland and Germany primarily be within this process? And Poland, within the entire political process associated with this issue, is in an absolutely fatal position, due to several factors. Now, back to the topic. Thoughtful. Migration pressure on Europe is going to be with us for a very, very long time. This is truly just the beginning of this whole process. This political issue has been important for over a decade. In 2015, for the first time, this crisis really erupted with great force. But this topic will accompany us for a long time, for the next few decades, because demographic trends are absolutely undeniable. The population of Europe will age and decrease over time. Meanwhile, by 2070, the African population is projected to double. The doubling of a population in such a short time means millions of young people, often desperate people, willing to take enormous risks in the hope of a different life. Meanwhile, even now, the societies of most European countries are simply overwhelmed by migration. And again, I'm coming back to what I mentioned a few months ago. Today, to win elections, you often have to have an anti-migration stance. This even applies to the European left. Across Europe, social order hangs by a thin thread, almost with the inscription, "Please stop migration, or we will change the government." The current German government, for instance, uses rhetoric on migration that just a few years ago, coming from AfD politicians, would have sounded quite shocking. In general, the window of political correctness when it comes to migration is shifting incredibly because yes, the policy of the European Union today is to push migrants primarily to so-called safe third countries, mainly in North Africa. This is the main thrust of the Migration Pact. It's not intended to encourage migrants to settle here. On the contrary, it's already a signal of social change, stemming from the fact that sending people back and generally not recognizing asylum should be easier. Of course, there's also this mechanism of mandatory solidarity, meaning the relocation of migrants or payment if these migrants are not received. In any case, this specific Polish perspective is practically absent in this law, in this set of laws, because we are a border state, but the nature of our border is completely different from the nature of the southern border. Apparently, a lot of people have also come to Poland recently, but this is a completely different migration than the one in the west of the continent. Anyway, data from the Polish Economic Institute shows that 78% of Ukrainians of productive age living in Poland actually work. This is a higher indicator than for Poles, and an indicator that for this migration, which often continues to Western Europe, is something completely abstract. There are few countries that view migration in the same way as Poland. And there are many more countries that have a problem and want that problem to become a common problem. In Poland, the Migration Pact is criticized by absolutely everyone, both the opposition and the ruling party. But just think, if this were the case all over Europe, this law could not have come into being. This is the problem. What is a dominant opinion in Poland, from right to left, is a marginal opinion in European politics. And this isn't about ideological affiliation. It's not about whether it's right or left. In Spain, the left is in power. In Italy, the right is in power. But from the point of view of all countries in the south of the continent, the optimal solution is to create a central tool to distribute migrants throughout Europe, because for obvious geographical reasons, they are struggling with problems that are different from ours. It's not about ideological affiliation, whether it's right or left. Basically, it's about economic geography and development. The South wants to unify the problem. The same goes for the center, to which the migrants are heading because this center is already saturated with migrants. So we have the South for a common solution, the center for a common solution, and somewhere on the borders of the European Union which says, wait a minute, we don't want this. So what then, if we don't want this? And here we come to a very, very important issue, because in my opinion, the Migration Pact is an excellent and absolutely perfect example of how the European Union is being reformed. How deep changes are happening within the European Union, because when you hear reform of the European Union, you might think about big conferences that change treaties, or referenda, or significant meetings. If that's what you think, you have a completely wrong view of what the reform of the European Union actually is. It is happening right now. The reform of the European Union, which is happening very quickly before our eyes, is based on a process of legal changes that expand the competences of central institutions in the European Union in a way that avoids the need for unanimous voting on the forum of the Council of the European Union. In this particular case, the Migration Pact significantly increases the competences of Central European institutions. In fact, from now on, the European Union will centrally deal with a very important issue for the political future of every European country and Europe as a whole. This is a significant expansion of the European Union's competences, and it won't stop at any stage. This set of laws, was not voted on by unanimous vote. First, at the Council of the European Union, the government of Mateusz Morawiecki lost the vote when, for example, it was decided how this law was to be processed, or whether the law came out of the Council of the European Union to the European Parliament. Then, when the law returned from the European Parliament to the Council of the European Union for a final decision, Donald Tusk lost the vote, even though he was absolutely convinced, very confident, that he would block it. He did not block it, and we moved on to the traditional Polish chorus of chuckles, nothing happened, because this law wouldn't come into effect anyway. But the way this law is processed truly highlights how changes are taking place in the European Union. That is, changes are being made using a path that a few years ago would have been rather inappropriate, because in matters where a directional decision of the Council would have required unanimity, that step is simply not present. It wasn't there in this procedure. Okay, but why am I talking about the Migration Pact in the context of what's happening on the Polish western border? Well, precisely because I believe these matters are directly connected. Their common denominator is, where does the decision lie about who can and who cannot stay on the territory of a given state? Who really decides about it? And this seems to me a bit of a test balloon. Because if we accept a situation in which a decision by German services means someone becomes a problem for Poland, not Germany, we don't want this person, take him, he certainly came from Poland. And if all this happens within procedures where, if the Polish Guard tells German services to leave, they simply drive 60 kilometers away and let the person out through the border there, then we de facto, in this way, lose control over our own territory. We lose control over the border. On the matter of migration, and primarily regarding the Migration Pact, Polish public opinion is being blatantly deceived. During the election campaign, both Rafał Trzaskowski and Karol Nawrocki, those who say that Poland is excluded from the Migration Pact because of the Ukrainians, are deceiving you. Rafał Trzaskowski, during the election campaign, at one point started talking about how 10 years ago, when he was a deputy minister, he enforced this type of record, but the Migration Pact was adopted last year. All this talk that Poland is excluded from the Migration Pact because of the Ukrainians is based solely on rhetoric and some political deal. This is not something that results from the law, which the European Commission states directly. Thoughtful. The European Commission says it directly, but the other side is also deceiving you. The other side also deceives you, which, for a complicated problem where it's very difficult to find a solution, offers you a trivially simple solution. For example, President-elect Karol Nawrocki, who unilaterally says, annoyed, I will announce the Migration Pact, and that's it. But in what way, how can a Polish president unilaterally announce that a given EU law doesn't apply? How is that supposed to work? Of course, we can pretend that this law doesn't exist. We can choose not to respect this law. And that's why it was written in this law that we either accept immigrants or we pay. And in a situation where money flows net from Brussels to Poland or vice versa, such a penalty for not accepting immigrants cannot be avoided. If the European Commission decides that Poland must be punished for not accepting immigrants, it has a legal basis for this. It has possibilities for this. And of course the courts could be the institution. And here, the matter is truly complicated. You can look at it in two ways. On the one hand, this matter is really ambiguous. Both the treaty scope of EU institutions and member states, as well as the procedure of this law, make this matter ambiguous. But the other side of the coin is that EU institutions, including the courts, are on the front line of expanding the competences of EU institutions, including their own competences, in relation to other institutions, not only to Polish institutions, but generally to other European or state institutions. So the chances that the Tribunal of Justice of the European Union would undermine the Migration Pact are very small. Migration will be a very important political issue in Europe for the next few decades. Meanwhile, even now, most European countries are overwhelmed by migration, and to maintain social and political order, they strive to unify this issue, to shift the burden, to push the problem beyond their borders. And a law has been created for this purpose. It seems to me that what is happening on the western border of Poland is a symptom of this wider process. The Germans are saying, annoyed, we don't want this man, and this is your problem now. Please take him away, because he certainly came to us from Poland. And the Migration Pact comes into effect in 2026. In the matter of this great, very serious international game, which is a fight for the future of European migration policy, Polish politics has to offer you mainly a game and a deception of reality. But in all of this, it's worth not losing sight of what, in my opinion, is the heart of this whole issue. Where will the decision-making in this area come from? Who will it depend on? Who and on what principles should be in a given territory? On the one hand, it seems to me that this is an absolutely fundamental, basic function of the state. But on the other hand, most European countries want a central solution to share their problems. This issue is already spreading the Schengen zone, and this is just the beginning. Again, we are only at the beginning of this whole process.
And of course, the EU institutions are an absolutely objectified technocratic tool used to construct policy at the continental level, and in no case do they interfere with the internal policy of individual member states. But if we already have this very important observation behind us, it's worth considering one more scenario. What if this mechanism of mandatory solidarity, and once again, who came up with that name? What if this mechanism, which either accepts immigrants or pays for them, will be instrumentally used to pressure and interfere with the internal policy of individual member states, especially those like Poland, which are taxable in this area? What if, as long as one option is in power, there will be no problem, and if the power changes, which is natural in a democracy, the problem will suddenly appear? And it's worth considering how we want to react to this. Not us, the civic platform, not us, the government, not us, the left, not us, the Confederation, not us, the law and justice, but how we want to approach this matter as a state, as a society. How are we supposed to not let ourselves be played? How to sometimes stop from hitting political opponents when there's an opportunity, because of the state's narrative, because there is something higher. I mean, I think we have all the ingredients here for us, as a society and a state, to be completely played out with the topic of concert migration. There are financial levers, there are emotions, and those emotions will be turned to the limit. And to be honest, I think it's worth asking this question: how do we navigate through this crisis on this topic, considering the Polish state's rationale? Even if this question is to be left unanswered, at least let it be voiced.